Welcome to week 2. Let's get started. The process of jumping in. So there's a few elements in this class that will help you develop as a creative writer. I focus on the process, reading as a writer, and the act of writing. So let's break those 3 elements down, which are usually part of the whole process that a writer develops throughout their career in order to write creatively. So writing is a process. You may have heard that statement before, but just to break it down, the key here is that writing is not a natural process for human beings. We think it is because, we were raised to write. We were raised to read. We've been learning it since we were very, very young. So it seems like it's almost a natural talent. But believe it or not, it's not. It took us as a species a very long time to learn how to write, to come up with symbols that mimicked language. And so, since this is not something we're innately attuned to as a species, we need to, help our brains get into the writing mode. Okay, we do that in a series of steps and actions that the brain becomes used to over time to help you, write optimally. Okay, so by a writing process, I essentially just mean the steps you take in order to create something in the written word. Okay, something that's organized, something that is polished. Okay. So here is an activity if you choose to accept it. You can draw your writing process. By doing this, it helps, narrow in on all of the steps you currently take right now when you are writing something creatively. The steps you take when you write creatively might be different than the ones you would if you were writing an essay. Okay. As an example, I will share my writing process. Depending on what I'm writing, the process will take different shapes. I'm going to focus on poetry because that's what this first unit will be about, poetry. I'll share more about my writing process as we move on through the course and the different genres we'll focus on. For right now, we'll just focus on poetry. So as you can see, I need constant silence or white noise in the background, like at a cafe, in order to write. I can't write to music. I can't write to any distracting noise. If I hear some water dripping out of the sink, it drives me mad. I cannot function unless it's purely silent. Okay, I get distracted easily. So for you, part of your process might include music. Okay, part of it might include going outside, right? For me, most of the time, that's not the case. I have a guest room in where I live, and in it is a desk, and it works also as my office, right? So I actually work and I write at a desk. When I start writing, I don't always know what I want to write, or if I do, I have a general idea, right? I go, okay, well, I feel like writing about perhaps a relationship I had with a parent, with my dad, maybe. So the first step I take is usually I free write. Okay, and free writing is an activity of writing by association. Just letting your brain move. Letting you write without thinking. Okay, you just keep that pen moving. And by doing that, your brain lets go of a lot of blocks that you might have. You might overthink the act of writing so much that you don't actually start writing anything. You talk yourself out of writing things down before you can even get started. And free writing kind of cuts right through that. It just forces you to get the words on the page. You don't have to keep it. In fact, most of this you probably won't keep. But because, again, we're not natural writers, we're not, born to write. As a species, you need to rev up the engine, So that's what I do. I start by free writing, usually 2 to 3 pages, just to kind of figure out my topic, what are the various ways I might tackle it, what my feelings are. If I'm writing on paper, I just keep going. And then if I stumble upon something that I think might be an entryway into the poem or a good line, or an idea, I usually start in the margin and then I just keep going. And then I star whatever I feel is interesting. And then I might go back and save those lines. But most of what I write in the free write, I don't keep. Um, Sometimes, and actually most times, I will be writing on a computer if I'm not writing by hand, which I do both. I'll write by hand and I'll write on a computer. And while I'm on the computer, I will free write about whatever topic I'm trying to write about. And then I will delete it. Some people will keep everything they write. That is not me. I will write and delete and write and delete. And I might do that for a good hour before I stumble upon a line where I go, oh, that's the poem. That's what I'm looking for. Sometimes I change my mind completely. I will write and I'll delete and delete until finally I thought I was writing a poem about my dad, and now I'm writing a poem about my cat. And I found the poem. There it is. Okay. So free writing just kind of allows you to find the poem. You're not going to be able to write a poem in your head, usually. Some people, sometimes a poem will come to you, but most times it doesn't. You have to really generate a lot of work before you find the poem. Sometimes if I'm having a hard time getting into my topic, I will start the day by reading. I might pick up a poetry book and I go, I feel like, I'm in a Zachary Schomburg mood. I'm in a, Maya Angelou mood. Whatever mood I feel like I want to be in, whatever language or style I kind of want to adopt that day. I'll just pick up a book and I'll just read a few poems. And, usually you'll read some poems and then you'll be like, oh, now I'm inspired. Now I really want to go and write my own stuff. And then at that point you close the book and you start writing. So when I was young, I did used to work on a bed because I, was a college student, and the room I was renting, maybe in a condo or an apartment, it acted as my, my bedroom, my office. It acted, I ate in my room, that is your living room is your bedroom. So that room was all of those spaces. And so when I was young, I would write on the couch, I would write on a bed, I would write, in various places. As I've gotten older, like I said earlier, I just work at a desk, right? It's very work-like. Doesn't sound very romantic, but that's just what I do. In the summer, when it's very nice, I do have a backyard, and I will sit in a chair in the backyard for a few hours and write by hand, usually. If that's in the summer, when it's nice and warm. But most times it's in a pretty boring space. More boring, the better. Less distractions so I can focus on my work. Focus on your process. What are the various steps that you will take in order to create something? One of the journals for this week tackles this, where you describe your process. And then throughout the semester, you'll try different things. I'll give you different tasks, different ways, different strategies to fold into your process that might help you in the future. So questions to consider about a process. Not everyone uses the same kind of process. If you go on online, you'll find podcasts, which, some I will link to those journals, about the process that writers use in order to write. It's kind of a magical formula for every writer to come up with their own, magical formula that really gets you into the perfect space that you need in order to write. So things to consider about a process is, why do writing processes differ? Why do different writers have different methods and routines and rituals? Does everyone include revision in their process? You might not. Maybe your revision doesn't happen for weeks after you've written a draft. I will usually do a very regimented. I will write a draft, maybe a poem, and then a couple days later, I will come back to it and I will revise it. And then I'll come back to it a couple days later and I'll revise it. I might have a workshop I go to. So I have a very step-by-step approach to my process, but for you, that might not be the case. The definition of revision might be different for different people. What form can the writing process take? How do you plan when you write? Do you outline? Do you free write? Sometimes I do outline, not always poems, but I will outline a lot of my creative nonfiction. Is the writing process necessary? Why or why not? Some people think, you just wait until you're inspired and then you just write the poem and then you're done. That's not necessarily my method. And a lot of the lessons we learn throughout the semester, it will not follow that process. It's not a lot of, it's a lot of, writing off the cuff, but it's also, I encourage revision. And so I feel that revision is very, very, very important, at least in the professional writing world, or people who write, do creative writing professionally. They're very heavy revisers. And so I do focus a lot on revision, but there are some creative writers who don't do that. Process and routine, the productive writer. We can't rely on the muse to get our work done. We need to create space for it. And the muse thrives in routine. The more you can automate your process and routine, the more your brain is free to play in a creative space. So with that said, professional creative writers write almost every single day. You are not necessarily in a space to do that right now. It takes, years to develop an interest in creative writing and to do a lot of studying, go to college sometimes. Not all writers go to college, but some do. And they usually do develop some kind of process. And then when they start to take it very seriously, they will start to question productivity and what things that they can do to get the most gains out of their work and their efforts and their time. I would imagine most writers, young writers, start out waiting for the muse to find them, waiting for inspiration to strike. And that works out very well in the beginning. But as time goes on, it becomes more difficult to rely on the muse to show up when you want it to, right? As our time frees up and we think, okay, I want to dedicate my time to this. And you sit to write, the muse isn't always there. And you kind of wonder why. Or if you only write when you're inspired, you find that you don't write as often as you would like. So most professional creative writers have hacked the process in a way. And this advice actually works for just about anything you want to learn. It's not just creative writing. You could, want to be a skateboarder and, you want to be more productive and make more gains in that, in gaining that skill. So if you wanted to learn anything, these kind of tips might actually help you be productive in those ways. So for writing specifically, you want to try and, if you want to do this seriously and you want to be more productive, or you wonder why you're not being as productive as a writer or a skateboarder or whatever, it's best to kind of start developing a routine. I don't want to say a habit. Some people say, oh, well, you should develop good habits. I don't like the word habit because habit implies that you do something without thinking. And I don't think we're ever going to sit down to write without thinking. We're never going to just all of a sudden look up one day and go, oh my gosh, I'm writing. I didn't know when that happened. That's not going to happen, right? You had to make a conscious choice to sit down and write. Even brushing your teeth. A lot of people say, oh, brushing your teeth is a habit. I don't believe brushing your teeth is a habit. You have to make a choice. You don't just suddenly look in the mirror, and realize, oh my God, I'm brushing my teeth. When did that happen? You make a conscious choice to go into the bathroom and brush your teeth. Habits are like biting your nails. It's like, oh, you don't even realize you're doing it. And then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I'm biting my nails, and it's a bad habit. Or smoking, smoking is a compulsory thing. You can't help it. You have to go do it. That is a habit. That's something where something gnawing at you so much you can't ignore it and you have to go and do it. And until you satisfy it, it's just going to, beat you up until you do. To me, that's a habit. And writing is not a habit. Writing is something you have to force yourself to sit in the chair and do a lot of times. But if you can automate the process in some way by doing it often, okay, what that does is it gets your brain used to it. So you fight yourself less to come and sit down. You stop thinking so much in big absolutes, like I will sit and write an entire story today, and then you don't do it, and then you get angry about it at yourself, or you wonder why you can't. Those kinds of thinkings really make it difficult to sit down and write and be creative. So what you do instead is you say, I'm going to free write for 3 pages. And that lets your brain write. And then suddenly you've been writing for a half hour when you wouldn't have sat and written in the first place. You might time your writing. I'm going to sit and write for an hour. Well, that's an hour of writing you maybe didn't do if you hadn't set the timer, because maybe you would have only written for 20 minutes because it just felt like an hour. But usually setting a timer will make you speed things up. So little things to start, and then you add on over time. For example, you might want to start doing morning pages. And there's a link here. You can click on the link in the slides that I've provided. And the morning pages were created by Julia Cameron from a book called The Artist's Way. And I'm not necessarily promoting the book. I kind of find it a little too airy and artsy for me, in the sense that it relies on some pseudoscience stuff. And it's just not my thing. But my mom loves that book. In it, though, she does have a really good activity where she asks her reader to dedicate 3 pages a day to free writing. And those pages are specifically not to be kept. They are not to be kept. They are to be written and then thrown away, because that is just the extra superfluous stuff that, is on the surface. And you want to get below the surface to get into the good writing. And so the morning pages are very therapeutic. They're very good for writers to kind of cough out all of that negative self-talk. And also what you can do with it is develop a routine with it. If you start the day every day writing 3 pages, the idea of writing doesn't feel so daunting anymore, right? And if you've already got 3 pages down, in a couple of weeks, it's very easy to fold in a 4th page. Maybe even then a 5th page. And then that page isn't free writing. That page is more structured writing. So you see how you kind of start folding in, start small and you fold in more writing over time. Writing on a schedule is very helpful. I have a type of schedule that I follow where I try to keep a streak going, where I write 2 hours every single day. That is my goal. I try to write every single day, 2 hours without fail. Is any of it any good? Not necessarily, but it keeps me going and it makes the process of writing easier. So when the muse does show up, I'm ready. And you stack your routines, right? You write for three pages a day, or for, like 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, you fold in an extra page. And then a week later, you fold in another page. And you've already developed the routine of showing up. So adding in more pages makes it much easier. It's helpful to add in your process, utilizing a mix of free writing, reading, outlining, and drafting. For me, it's much easier to think I'm going to come and free write and then read and then outline and draft something than it is for me to think, oh gosh, I've got to write this whole story from start to finish. That's really hard to do. It's a lot easier to think, I'm not going to write a story from start to finish. I'm going to free write. Then I'm going to read a little bit. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to outline the story. Then I'm going to take each bullet from the outline and I'm going to develop that a little bit more, right? Like you do it in layers, so that you're not trying to just create a whole story all at once. You're breaking it up into a set of actions that at the end of those actions, perhaps a week or so, you have a story. And then accountability is very important. Usually we won't do things without deadlines. For example, you take a class because it has deadlines and it forces you to study. It forces you to learn things and write your essays and submit them. Without the deadlines, you probably wouldn't do it. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, why am I procrastinating all the time?" Because we all procrastinate. And the only way through it is usually to have some kind of deadline and have a real one. For me, if I don't think the deadline is real, it doesn't really work. I've tried that. I've tried to write, I'll have a deadline next week, and it's just my own personal deadline. Sometimes they work, but most times they don't. And most times I need to have someone waiting for me on the other end of that deadline saying, "Renee, where is your stuff?" So that's the great thing about a class is I'm going to hold you to a deadline, and your grade is sort of attached to it. I mean, you do have deadlines for your major assignments. And if you didn't have that deadline, there's a good chance you probably wouldn't write it in the first place. How do you get this when you don't have a class? Well, you can find it in the real world for free. Meetup.com is a really good place. One place on Meetup that you can join is called Shut Up and Write, and you just show up and you hang out for 10 minutes with a group of people you don't know, and you do it through Zoom now. You can't meet in person anymore because of the pandemic, but it used to be you'd meet in person, and I do them all the time. And you show up, and then you write for 2 hours. Everyone's silent at the cafe, or they're silent behind their Zoom screen. And then after 2 hours, you come back and you chat about what you worked on, and that's it. And just knowing that other people are there with you makes you feel like it's holding you accountable and you'll focus on it. Taking a class is helpful for deadlines. Joining a community in some way, going to open mics, having friends who are creative writers, always having your finger on the creative community pulse is really helpful for keeping you motivated. And this works for anything. You skateboard more because you hang out with friends who skateboard. You run more because you hang out with friends who run. You play video games more because your friends are part of the video game community. Right? So we surround ourselves with people who are like us, and those people kind of like, have us, we end up doing more things that they like doing that we like doing, right? Because you're part of that community. So if you want to be more productive as a writer, join the writers community, and I'll give you more resources as that moves on. Our first unit is poetry. Poetry, most people find it kind of hard. They find it kind of difficult. They might have negative feelings about poetry. Some people might not. That's great. In creative writing, I myself entered the world of creative writing through poetry. And I'll go over that soon in a couple of slides. But for now, it's important to kind of, be in touch with your feelings about poetry and to be open to, broadening your horizons a little bit and your understanding of poetry, and coming to terms with maybe a lot of that fear or anxiety that you might feel, or not liking poetry. Those feelings might change in the next few weeks, and I'm hoping that they do, because we're not necessarily going to be engaging with poetry on a level of being tested. You're not going to be tested on this stuff. You're not going to be asked to write an essay. You're going to be asked to read poetry in order to gain influence and to gain strategies from other poets, so you can create your own poetry. Poetry has changed a bit because of the pandemic, in an actually very good way, because it's made it more available, a medium that's more available to other people through Zoom. I myself actually I run an open mic called Time to Arrive. You can find it on meetup.com, and you can find it on Eventbrite, and I've linked that to the class. And the community out there, people are really into poetry right now, and they're into reading it and hanging out with other writers and finding out who's out there and hearing other people's work. And you can go to a poetry reading in Ireland and then later on in the day, go to a poetry reading in France, in Paris, and then, finish the day off with a poetry reading in California. Zoom has made that possible. If anyone's interested in doing any of that, I actually know a lot of people who do that, like throughout the week. They're going to multiple poetry readings and staying, connected to the community. And these are people who maybe had never written poetry before. So it's important to try and come, forgive yourself in the past, or forgive the poetry in the past, or maybe being really difficult, to forgive your teachers of the past. Oh, it was so hard to get through my poetry class or to learn poems. Why don't writers just say what they mean? It's an art, and for the next few weeks, we're gonna tackle poetry, and I think you're gonna end up learning to enjoy it. I think a lot of people who maybe aren't poets, they'll learn to gain a lot from it. So with that in mind, if you would like to do a free association exercise, maybe take a moment to think about your history, your understanding, your feelings about poetry. You can think of an actual poem, a lesson you experienced, something someone like a teacher or a friend or the system, like school, has said about poetry. You can think of one you've written. You can think of one you've read. You can think of one you've hated, or think of one you've loved. Now, without stopping, let's try free writing. Okay? Write a list of the words or phrases that come to mind about the concept of poetry and what it means to you. So just take 30 seconds and do free association writing. Every writer has their own story about how they came to the craft of writing. Usually it started with reading. Usually it started with books that a writer loved in a genre that they grew to love, and they started writing on their own. And for me, I started out enjoying poetry the most. I read a lot. I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. I've read a lot about that in your responses this week. A lot of people like sci-fi and fantasy, but I also loved all types of literature. I just really loved to read. I didn't necessarily ever think I would become a writer until a bit later. But when I first started writing, it was poetry. And I came to poetry through music, as many poets do. But the music I found that got me into poetry was actually a little bit different usually than most people would find. I had very interesting history, and I won't go into it now. But here are some links to some of the music that got me into reading poetry, mostly romantic poets, which is an era of poetry, and Victorian era poetry, another era of poetry. People think romantic poetry means about love, and that's not what that term means. It's like modernism. That's another term for a type of poetry. And so if you click any of these links, you would maybe click on The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and you'd listen to it and think, wow, that sounds really hard, or maybe I'm a little bored. And you might be disbelieving that maybe I was 16 at the time, who was drawn to this poem. And the reason I was drawn to this poem was not because I was, some nerd. Right, or super smart. It was because in the 80s there was a band called Iron Maiden, and they did a song about this poem. And I heard the song and I really liked it. And one day I was in the library and I looked over and I saw a book that said The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I went, hey, isn't that song by that hair band from the 80s? I picked it up. I was like, it is that song. That's cool. And I didn't realize it was actually a poem. And that's how I found Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I found Blake and Keats, romantic era poets, through Lorena McKennitt. That in the 90s, I grew up in the 90s, or I was a teenager in the 90s, and during that time, Celtic stuff was very popular. My mom was very much into the New Agey stuff. She really liked New Agey, like Enya and Clannad. And one of the artists she used to listen to in the house was Lorena McKennitt. And she's kind of a world music artist. And she would take poems from, old poems, hundreds of years old, and she would put them to music. And when I first listened to her, I just really liked her music, and I had no idea that she was singing somebody else's work. I thought they were her lyrics. But then I learned, because, back then we had CDs and they would come with little booklets. I would read them and realize that she would put the, name of the song, but then there would be a different author for the lyrics. And I thought that was odd. I'm like, wait, she didn't write this? And I read them, and she was, she sang Shakespeare in one of her albums. And I was very interested in that. And it was just sounded so pretty. She's just the way it was delivered, I really much enjoyed. So I would listen to her music and read along. And in that way, I gained access into romantic poetry and Victorian era poetry, and even some modernist poetry. As you can see in the bottom links here, there's a singer, and she did The Highwayman. And he, and this other guy, Phil Oakes, he also did The Highwayman, which is, a poem about a highwayman. And at that time, I really liked, fantasy, and there's horses, and there's danger, and there's true love in the poem, and all that stuff really excited me. But what was very important at this time when I was experiencing all this, and again, I was, a teenager, I was never told I was doing it wrong. I was never told that when I was reading and how I was experiencing this work was wrong, because I didn't have to write essays about it. I was just finding it on my own and jumping in and really enjoying the process. And I think if maybe I had shared this with somebody, maybe they would have said, okay, you're not reading that line right, or you're not quite understanding the point of that poem. So I guess I was very lucky in the sense that I never shared it. And then I just kept that love to myself, but really immersed myself in it because I truly did love it. And so over time, I did learn to read these works over experience and understand what I was reading. And I learned to revise some of my understanding from the past because I didn't quite understand it. Well, I thought I did, but I didn't. And that's okay, right? I would just focus on the stuff I did understand, and I just really enjoyed it. So, your relationship with poetry doesn't have to be one of essays and tests and teachers telling you might not be understanding it. Just come to it on your terms. Imagine things that you enjoy and seek out the things you enjoy and focus on those enjoyable things. If something's not fun, maybe skirt it and keep reading until you find something that's fun, or find another poem, right? You don't have to love poetry, but you can find poems that you love. When coming to poetry, maybe for the first time, not necessarily as someone writing an essay, not as a student trying to decode poems, but as a writer trying to gain influence from poems, it might be helpful to actively try to rewrite your feelings about the unknown, about the difficulty of what poetry is. Okay. You don't want to run away from the unknown in a poem. You don't want to run away from difficulty or the challenge of the poem. You want to embrace it. Poems are a little difficult, and that's kind of the fun of it, right? And so you don't want to necessarily run away. You want to run towards and embrace it. And maybe, celebrate in the idea that you might not understand something, but no, you're not going to be tested, and you're not going to have to write an essay. You're just trying to get some influence and enjoy it on those terms. To do that, I've provided a long list of poems that I enjoy, but come from very different places. Okay. Different eras, different styles of poems you didn't even realize were poems, or that people were writing now. The type of poetry we write now is very different than the kind we did 200 years ago. But we can gain influence from all of those eras of poetry and inform our present understanding and who we are as our poets now. So here is a poem you probably recognize. It's called Ozymandias or Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. And the name might sound familiar. You might think of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was Percy Shelley's wife. Okay, we remember her. Unless you're a poet, you may not, or a literature major, you may not know Percy Shelley, but he was actually more famous than she was at the time. Okay, but now she's more famous than he is, because we all know Frankenstein and not everyone knows about Percy Shelley. However, if you're into sci-fi and fantasy like I am, I suggest you read Watchmen by Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore. It's a comic. It's one of the best graphic novels I think that exists. It's one of my favorites. I teach it in my 1B class. And one of the characters is named Ozymandias. and one of the heroes, superheroes. It's a kind of a story about superheroes if they were real, and it's very gritty and it's very dark. It's not a happy story. They did a movie which was okay, and they did a show, I believe on Amazon, that was like a sequel to it, which I thought was really very, very good. Anyway, so if you're into that, if you've read that book, or if you are interested in reading that and you're into those kinds of things, this poem is a direct reference in that story. So if you read Watchmen, you'll understand it even better if you know Ozymandias. So here's one of my favorite poems. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Now you might think that was difficult. Maybe you weren't always aware of what was going on in the poem. Your first reading of a poem, that's common. That makes sense. In your second reading, right, you might read a little slower. You might really think about the lines to see what's going on. Here's a quick summary. You met a traveler from an antique land. You met someone from an ancient land, right? And they were standing in the desert. They tell you a story. They said, I was standing in the desert and I saw this in the middle of nowhere, this statue, but all that was left of it were these two legs standing on kind of a pedestal. And underneath it was a face, right? Like the face was on the ground next to the feet. And that's all that was left. And underneath the feet on the pedestal, it read, "Look, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains." Right? So it ends at despair, and then there's nothing behind the statue. So you can imagine, okay, there's this angry face in the ground, and there's these legs, and that's all that's left, and then we're in the middle of the desert, and there's nothing there. And there's this really scary, sinister statement. I am the King of Kings. Look on my works. There's nothing there. Right? And so then we go, oh, okay, I can see this is a metaphor, for various, someone who thought they were going to live forever or their legacy would live forever. And clearly time has erased it, right? And various other things. Right. So that is one poem. And that sounds maybe like poetry to many of you. You're like, yes, that's poetry. It rhymes. It's got lines that are around the same size. It's a little confusing. It uses maybe vocabulary that doesn't make sense. But then if we move forward in time, you'll notice things get a little bit more easier to understand. Comes maybe out like a puzzle, right? It doesn't necessarily look the same way as Ozymandias. This is Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school, where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So that again might sound like poetry, right? It rhymes. It's kind of sing-songy, lyrical, and it's about death, which is really heavy as a subject and a very popular topic that writers like to write, poetry like to write about. But Very different from Ozymandias, right? Which was about 80 years before Emily Dickinson was born, or maybe even longer than that. And then if we move forward a bit more, we will find 8 Count by Bukowski. And I love Bukowski. A lot of people don't like him. I think he's really funny. And just to warn you, there's a swear word in this poem. We don't shy away from those things in this class. Maybe you don't want to be gross in your poetry. You don't want to gross anybody out. But, swear words are okay. So this is a poem many years after over 100 years after Emily Dickinson. This is one shape poetry has taken now. 8 Count. From my bed, I watch 3 birds on a telephone wire. One flies off, then another. One is left, then it too is gone. My typewriter is tombstone still. And I am reduced to bird watching. Just thought I'd let you know, fucker. I love that poem. It's really funny. Look at the line breaks. They're so short, right? Very simple sentences, and you slowly get through the poem until you get to the punchline, right? That's a poem. That works. Charles Bukowski, some people really, really love him. I do. Some people really, really hate him. There's not a lot of people in the middle, okay? But just look at that difference between Ozymandias and Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Could Not Stop for Me, right? And 8 Count. Thanks is a wonderful poem. It's one of my favorites by Joseph Komunyaka, and I implore you to read that one. Happy Endings is hilarious. It's about fairy tales. It's by Margaret Atwood. The Tiger is he was before Percy Shelley, but very, very beginning of the Romantic era. How do you enter the poem on your terms so that you can embrace things that are confusing or contradictory, or to help heal from whatever experiences you've had with poetry in the past? How to enter into it on a creative level where you can gain influence from it and learn as a writer. Here are some strategies. Read poems out loud. They are meant to be read out loud. They exist in 2 spaces simultaneously, on the page and orally, right? They're meant to do that. And so just reading a poem, you're not going to get the entire effect. So read it out loud to get as best effect you can from the poem, to experience it on multiple levels. Zero it in on what you enjoyed. Give yourself permission to focus on what you enjoyed and to kind of gloss over the stuff that you didn't, right? And really look at what you enjoyed and ask yourself, why did you like that? Actively visualize and activate your senses. Work within the poem, read it, and try to see the descriptions of what the poet is describing or what they're trying to tell you. Smell what they ask you to smell, hear what they ask you to hear, heighten your own perception while you're reading the poem and try to experience it as vividly as you can. Paraphrase, especially for those older poems. Translate the poem into plain speak, into how you would say it, right? Read the line and go, I don't understand that word. Go look the word up and then go, okay, well, if I had said it, what word would I have used instead? Right? And then that'll help you decode the line and kind of figure out, maybe if there's a story in the poem, help you decode the story or what the author's trying to say. But, read it on your terms and try to translate it into how you would say it so you can, enter into it on that level. Keep track of the sentences. If you can't, look at the subjects, look at the verbs, right? Like, how are the people or the things in the poem interacting and acting out into the world of the poem? Find your meaning first. Don't think of the meaning that you think the critics are supposed to find, or, the right answer in a test or an essay. Just find your own meaning. Just read it on your terms and go, I think it means this. Now, it's important to also try and come up with meaning that is rooted in appropriate or an accurate interpretation of the poem by close reading, at least if you read it correctly. But even then, if you can still enjoy it and you didn't even read it quite right, that's okay. You still enjoyed it. Find your meaning first. And believe it or not, there are different meanings to poems. There's not just one solid meaning to a poem. People read them in different ways. Look for patterns. Usually poems play with patterns. They're very much like a game in that sense. And so look for patterns in poetry. And by doing that, you can decode themes. Read with other people. Have other people read it out loud, or you read it out loud to them, or take turns reading, different stanzas. You'll get more out of it, and you'll talk to other people and ask them what they think. And they might disagree with you. And that's great, because then you can share your interpretation of the poem, and that enhances their understanding. Speculative questions are very good. Asking questions that cannot easily be answered, or at least can't even be answered. There maybe is no answer. Why did Percy write that poem about Ozymandias and that statue? What was he reacting to? I don't know. Maybe you'd have to look historically and figure that out. Maybe there's a personal level in there that we don't know about. Maybe that's a question. What personal feelings did he have about the themes in that poem? Right? We may not know, but we can guess. We can guess, and we can read with that lens. Apply poetry and your reading in general to your own life experience, because that is how we decode meaning in our brains. That's how you do it. If you can't bounce it off your life experience in some way, you're going to have a really hard time understanding anything. Okay? Because usually that's how we go through life. Have we seen it before? Our brain goes, yes. Then it knows how to move forward. Has our brain not seen this before? No. Okay, what is it similar to? And on a very basic level, is it similar to something that is safe or something that is dangerous and scary? So I'm hoping that you won't react to poetry and think it's scary, right? I want you to try to shift your brain over to not something that poetry is not something that you should fear. It's something that you should embrace and run toward, not run away from. Okay. So to do that, you have to embrace poetry in your way. And here's a strategy to help. When reading poetry, something that's considered difficult or confusing, it's important to approach it on your terms, which means you need to look inward to define what those terms are. What are your aesthetics? What are things that you enjoy? And you go and you find work that reflects that. Over time, you will build, an aesthetic that you didn't know you had. Or, we learn to like Brussels sprouts. You will learn to like poetry and writing that you didn't know you'd ever be interested in. But if you aren't in tune with yourself and what you enjoy and why, you're going to have a hard time finding anything. Okay. It's also important to be open-minded, embrace difficulty, and enjoy the challenge of it. Don't run away from challenges. We want to embrace them and try to decode them. So find a poem. Here's an activity. Here's some resources for you. Here's the two big ones online: Academy of American Poets and Poetry Foundation. You don't need to buy poems, right? We don't need to spend money. You could just find them online. And I ask that you go on there and you shop around for things you may enjoy, right? Think of it like going to an art gallery. And in the art gallery, somebody says you can have any painting you want. And in that art gallery, there's so many different kinds of paintings from so many different eras, historical and different planets, maybe. There's weird stuff in there, right? And you're like, well, what kind of art would I want on my wall, right? And just think that when you read poetry, it's like you're hanging a piece of art in your brain, right? That you could carry with you for a short time or longer if you read the poem more often, okay? What would you like in there? What kind of things would you like to look at again? What would you like to put on your wall and display? And what would you like to just read for a moment and then put away, right? Just be aware of your feelings when you're reading a poem and why you like something. So go into one of those websites, Academy of American Poets or Poetry Foundation, and shop around. Find different poems and read them and ask yourself, would I keep this one? And why? Another way to experience poetry, again, is verbally. And The Slowdown with Tracy K. Smith, and that's also in one of our journals for this week. She is fantastic. She was a poet laureate for a long time, and then she was She was in Obama's inauguration. She is fantastic. She wrote a book called Life on Mars, one of my favorite poetry books of all time. And she runs this very short podcast. It's about 10 minutes long. And she introduces a poem, give a little bit of history background, or she gives her own personal take on it. And then she reads the poem, and that's it. And she does it every day. And it's a wonderful way to start the day. I know people who will listen to it in the morning, and while they're listening, they'll write down lines that they liked or words that caught them, right? Because they're trying to gain influence or whatever. It's just a wonderful way to experience poetry. So, how do you read a poem as a reader, and understand it, beyond just your personal do you like and not like, and then discard or keep, right? How do we take it one step further? As a poet, you got to get good at this. As a literature major, you got to get good at this. If not, that's okay. It's good to at least understand how language works and to practice poetry on your own. This is an exhaustive list, and it takes a really long time to learn all this stuff. And, you might like poems because of the way they sound. And in that way, you might want to just decode it on that level. Maybe you're like, I just want to understand what it means. And so you're going to focus just like on translation, and that's fine. But if you want to write a poem and you want to write a poem that sounds good, it's a good way to read other poems and decode how they play with sound so that you too can play with sound in similar ways or gain strategies from them. And so as a literature major, all the skills that you've learned, if you've written essays about poetry and stuff, and other works, you can use those strategies that you know them, right? And you're like, oh, I know what a metaphor is. Well, how can I write a metaphor? So this is an exhaustive list, kind of, and I don't expect you to memorize all the ways in which to engage a poem. You're going to pick the ways that you like the most. But here is just a long list of different ways that you can really get into a poem. Ask yourself, who's the speaker? What are their values? How do you know? And just know that when we talk about poetry, we don't talk about the authors being the speaker, because sometimes, the poet is not the one speaking. It's not necessarily, a poem is not necessarily about the feelings of the speaker. It's the feelings of the writer. It's the feelings of a speaker who could be fictional, and most oftentimes is. So don't say, oh, this poem bears his soul. No, you don't know that, because he could have been writing as he'd be writing a character from a character's point of view. And that is a lot of the times the case. So we don't say the writer of the poem, we say the speaker. What's the subject? What's the theme? Right? What's the message? Those are the ones I like a lot. Like, I want to know how they're really tackling this subject. What's the structure and the form? What are the patterns, the shape, the type, the language, the style, the genre? Imagery. I love imagery too, right? Like, what are the sensory details that they choose, and how do they stand kind of on their own, and what's their relationship to the others? What patterns do I see? Try to connect all the parts. Word choice. Some people really like word nerds, man. Look at the word choice. How are they choosing those words, and how is that like shaping their voice? What's the syntax? What's the order of the words? The structure of the sentence? Why are they structuring it that way? Where are those line breaks? How does that add to the meaning? Ambiguity, things that aren't quite clear. Are there multiple meanings to something, right? Sound and meter. Scansion is the method that we use for counting beats in a line. If you're, want to figure out the iambic pentameter of a poem, right? You can measure the beats. That's actually, it takes some practice, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. But if you are a songwriter, that's very helpful, because if you can figure out where the beats rise and lower and hit, you can match that to your songs. Rhyme, pace, beats, figurative language, similes, metaphors, sayings, tone, mood and attitude, symbolism and irony. What's beyond the literal, right? Allusion, references to other works, ideas, historical references, people bringing in whole eras of work that inform what you're reading. All of those things just kind of mix together, and some are stronger than others in different poems, and you're going to focus on different things. But that's just a really big list of all the various ways you can play with our language and our ideas and come up with something really interesting. right? And really something that a reader can take home with them and keep with them for a long time. And that you can then you read into a poem and shape and take for yourself. So for this week, I would like you to maybe try to write an advice poem. Okay. It can be in any form you want. You can write it in rhyme. You could write it in free verse. You could write the words in the sentences and they take some kind of shape, like a bird. You could add images to your poem. You could add big spaces. You could play with the page. You could write a prose poem. There's no line breaks at all. You could write maybe a song, some song lyrics. Although there's a debate here. Song lyrics are not necessarily poetry, but they do sound like poetry. Keep in mind that song lyrics are meant only to be sung, not read, whereas poetry is supposed to both be read and heard, right? So it's a very important distinction, and we'll go over that later. But a lot of people might be wanting to write poetry so that they can, write better song lyrics, and that's great. So if you come up with some song lyrics, great. So ask yourself, has anyone ever given you some strange advice? Whether good or bad, what was it? Did you ever apply the advice? If you didn't, why not? If so, how did it work out? Let's start with reading. Has anyone ever given, or what do you, okay, now that we're primed with the subject of advice, let's start trying a process. Okay, before we write the poem, let's engage in a bit of a process here. Let's experience another poem that gives advice and how that author plays with advice. Okay, so here you'll find a link. If you go to, on Canvas below this video lecture, you'll find all of these slides where you can click these links and, experience, the various links and media that I've provided for this lesson. While you watch this poem, it's actually a poem that's been animated. It's really fun. It's one of my favorite poets, Billy Collins. He's hilarious, right? Ask yourself, what do you like about this poem? What is it doing? What's memorable about it? What still stays with you after it's over? What surprised you most about the poem? That's very important, right? Because part of the things that we enjoy out of poetry are the surprises it gives us. And by surprises, I mean things you wouldn't expect, or even, the lesson you've learned, like, oh, they tricked me. They made me think it was going to go one way and it went another way, or it enhances your understanding of the world. And you didn't expect that your life would be changed by the end of this poem. Things like that. That's what I mean by surprise. What feelings did you have during the poem? It's very important to have feelings, to invoke them as you read. Okay, because a lot of people will read and then they're just reading and they're not trying to participate in any way. They're just trying to decode meaning, and you're not going to be able to decode any meaning if you don't have any feeling and you're not thinking about what the poem is doing to you on an emotional level. And this goes for lit majors too. If you're a lit major and you just write essays and stuff, it's very important to be in tune, because that's what authors are trying to do. They're trying to get an emotional reaction out of you, and it's very intentional that they do this. Okay, so if you invoke your emotions, you can figure out their intention, like what they meant to do. All right. How'd you like that one? That was a good one, right? Billy Collins is great. Now let's read another one. This is a Jamaica Kincaid Reading Girl. This is an anthologized poem. A lot of people know this poem. You may have actually written an essay about this one if you've taken your 1B class already. And this is a prose poem. There are no line breaks. It's one big brick of text. It's only one paragraph. Again, listen to the poem. And ask yourself, what do you like about it? What's memorable? What stays with you? What feelings do you have? And note how very, very different this poem is than the previous poem. Yet they both tackle the same topic, advice. Right. Now that we've gained some influence, we've listened, we've questioned the poem, we've asked what we like about the poem, what we feel was very effective, right? Try to utilize similar strategies. Try to, figure out what each of those poems did that you thought was successful, and then try to put it in your own work or help it inform you in your own work. Maybe they don't inform you stylistically, and maybe there aren't words in there or phrases that you really enjoyed, but maybe it helps kickstart your own creativity and just, helps you enter into your own poem, your own advice poem. So using the advice you wrote about already from the previous slide, or from the advice poem weekly activity, write a poem that either one maybe lists some advice you received that adds up to reveal something about the advice giver, the speaker, or both. So that one is similar to Jamaica Kincaid's poem, or projects the advice into an extreme unreality. If applied, how would it actually play out in the real world, as weird as it might be? Or apply practical advice to an unpractical situation. How might that play out? And again, that is similar to Billy Collins's approach to the advice poem. Good luck. Happy writing. Enjoy.